Berserk, plasma, Purgewater. That one just sounds cool to say, doesn't it? Purgewater. These are some of the elements in Horizon Forbidden West, and there are 8 in total. Acid, Adhesive, Berserk, Fire, Frost, Plasma, Purgewater, and Shock. And in this video, we are gonna rank them all. And it might shock you which one I think is the best, so you're definitely gonna wanna stick around. Hi everyone, I'm Chaz, and today we are gonna rank every element in Horizon Forbidden West. Which ones are the most useful? Which ones are still fun, even if they're not the most practical to use? And which ones, well, are completely useless? And to help me decide which element to rank and in which order, I've brought along this lovely assistant, this spinny wheel, who I've named PD, to help me out. Okay, PD, take it away. What's it gonna be? What's it gonna be? Berserk. Okay, Berserk. So technically not an element, Berserk and Adhesive are what's called status elements, but they both act and function a lot like the other elements in the Forbidden West, which is why I've included them in this list. And I did do a full video breakdown of how, when, and why you should use Berserk, which I'll link in the description below if you want to check it out. But Berserk is basically an updated version of the corruption that you got from Horizon Zero Dawn. When you inflict a machine with Berserk, it'll go crazy and essentially attack whatever's closest to it, whether that be Aloy or another machine. So it is typically best practice if you're inflicting Berserk at a distance, or if you're doing it up close, you just want to make sure to get the hell out of there as fast as possible so that the machines won't attack you. Now, Berserk does get compared to the Machine Master playstyle, where you're using the machines and overrides to fight on your behalf, but I actually find Berserk to be a lot more flexible. For one, because you can do it at a distance, but it also works on Apex variants of machines, so it's just a lot more flexible than just using overrides. Now, I would say too, for the most part, I didn't really use Berserk at all in some of my earlier playthroughs. In fact, I really didn't use it much at all until the release of the Burning Shores, when we got a handful of new weapons and a Valor Surge that really amplified the power of Berserk. We got the Emperor's Reign, which is a hunter bow that you can get in the Burning Shores, and we got the Berserk Class Valor Surge, which is probably my favorite new Valor Surge that was introduced with the DLC. Now, the Berserk Class Valor Surge does have a few advantages over just using Berserk by itself. For one, it'll last a full 60 seconds, so that's longer than what you would normally get if you just use Berserk with a regular weapon. And also, it'll inflict Berserk on an entire group of machines, so it's super useful, especially if you're going up against a group of machines that has one big bad machine like a Slaughter Spine or a Thunderjaw, and then there's surrounding smaller machines. So I actually find Berserk pretty useful under the right circumstances, and if nothing else, it's just a lot of fun to use. Now, one of the things I think they could do to make Berserk really powerful and really stand out is, since it's technically a status element, if you could also put on a regular element in addition to the status element. So if a machine's in Berserk, you could also put them in Freeze to deal even more damage, or so that machines are doing more damage to each other. But as it is right now, you can only inflict one status element or element at a time. They don't stack, but I think that would be a really fun thing to see. So Berserk, while it's useful, maybe not the most practical, but pretty fun to use, I'm gonna give it a B. Okay, PD, who's next? Ooh, Fire. Okay, Fire. One of the OG elements, one of the ones that carried over from Horizon Zero Dawn. Although if you played Horizon Zero Dawn, you know that Fire in the Forbidden West is a shell of what it was in Zero Dawn. I mean, they really nerfed this element. Now, one of the good things about Fire is that it deals damage over time, meaning for a short amount of time after the initial buildup of Fire, it'll continue dealing a small amount of damage. But the bad thing about Fire is pretty much everything else. I mean, it lasts for a very short amount of time, depending on the machine type, and the damage that it does over time is very, very small, especially when comparing it to some of the other elements that deal damage over time. Now, like all of the other elements, it's good for hitting canisters if you're hitting a canister of the same type. So any of those blaze canisters, you'll get a good size explosion from it. That's probably the best use case for Fire. Outside of that, it's really one of the elements that are probably the least effective. But my biggest complaint with Fire isn't actually the fact that it deals just such a small amount of damage over time. It's actually the fact that, a lot of these machines or even the human enemies aren't phased when they catch on fire. Like, they will just continue to hit you even though they're on fire. They don't have stop, drop, and roll a few thousand years into the future. I mean, come on. So yeah, because Fire isn't all that useful, I'm gonna go ahead and give Fire a C. Okay, PD, what's next? Purgewater. Okay, cool, Purgewater. This is another one of the elements that I've done a full and complete video breakdown, which I'll be sure to link in the description below. Purgewater will essentially put the machine into the drench state, which has 3 distinct advantages. For one, it makes the machines look completely badass. 2, it'll negate any of the status resistances that machine has. So if a machine is resistant to shock, but you really like to use shock, you can put the machine in the drenched state first, and that'll make it a lot easier to use shock on the machine. Now, it's completely debatable whether it makes sense at all or it's worth the time and effort to put the machine in one elemental status just to then put them in a different elemental status. And for the most part, I would say it probably isn't worth the time and effort it takes to do so. The exception to that, I would say, is if you're doing some sort of timed challenge, like a hunting grounds or in the arena. So in those situations, it might make sense to use Purgewater. But I would say for the most part, outside of those scenarios, it probably doesn't make much sense to use in the open world or just as part of the main story or the main story missions. Now, the third benefit of Purgewater, though, is where I do think that there's a particular amount of value, because once a machine is in the drenched state, it'll negate any of those machines' elemental attacks. So if you're going up against a Fire Claw Strider or an Acid Claw Strider, those can be really brutal machines to fight. Or if you're going up against a Slaughter Spine that just has all of these big plasma attacks, using Purgewater to first drench the machine so that you've got basically 30 to 60 seconds to attack that machine without them being able to use any of their elemental attacks, that can give you a significant advantage. So in that way, I do find that Purgewater is pretty useful in those certain scenarios. So not the most useless, but also not the most practical outside of a few scenarios. So I'm gonna go ahead and give Purgewater a B. Okay, PD, let's keep moving. Wait. What's this? A like and subscribe wheel? Oh, the like and subscribe wheel. That's right, you're trying to remind our viewers that as a small channel, every like and subscribe really counts. Okay, PD, go ahead and give that one a spin. Like. All right, if you're watching this video, be sure to give it a like. PD's orders. Okay, PD, let's keep it going. Frost, okay, Frost. Another one of the OG elements that carried over from Horizon Zero Dawn, but unlike Fire, Frost is extremely useful. It's the GOAT, it's arguably the best element of all of them. It's not one that deals damage directly to machines, but once you build up enough Frost, you put the machine in the brittle state, which not only temporarily stuns and slows down the machine, it significantly increases impact damage dealt to the machines. And by significantly, I mean like double. If you are absolutely looking to maximize damage to machines, Frost is a must-have. I recently did a video where I broke down how to kill any machine within one shot. I'll link that one in the description below. But Frost was absolutely at the center of it because it gives you such a significant increase in damage. This element is a must-have. Now, not necessarily a complaint, but one thing that I'd really love to see from Frost in the future is Frost shredders. Why don't we have Frost shredders? That would just be amazing. I'd love to see it. That would be great. But as it stands right now, even without that, Frost is great. I'm gonna give it S tier. Okay, PD, what do we got next? Adhesive. Okay, so complete opposite end of the spectrum from Frost, but like Berserk, Adhesive is technically a status element and not an element itself, but it does function a lot like the other elements. When it builds up in a machine, it puts them into the slow state. And I would say out of all of the element types, this is probably the one that I've used the least amount, but in principle, I really like the concept behind it. You've got this super sticky glue that you basically can stick onto these machines that will slow them down for a certain period of time. Now, I think the execution of this is just kind of where Adhesive falls a little bit flat. It just doesn't last all that long, and for a lot of machines, it's really not all that effective. I've definitely been plowed into or run over or hit by many machines while they were in the slowed state, so it doesn't really seem to be all that effective on machines. And again, it just doesn't last all that long. Now, I would say that one of the better cases to be made for using Adhesive is against flying machines, because flying machines are typically hard to hit in the first place because they're just all over the place. So if you can use something like Adhesive to bring the machine down and deal damage to them while they're on the ground, it can be a lot easier to deal with some of those flying machines like Dreadwings. And if you're a fan of certain types of weapons like warrior bows or blast slings, there are some decent adhesive options out there. I would say similar to Berserk, it would actually be really cool if you could stack another element on top of the status element. So once they're in the slowed state, then you could use Frost to inflict additional damage to them, or Plasma, or one of the other elements. But for now, not really a whole lot of use in using Adhesive, so I'm gonna give this one a C. Okay, PD, who's up next? Plasma. Okay, Plasma. Now, I've spoken about Plasma a lot in other videos, I did a full and complete breakdown of it, which I'll link in the description below. Over time, I think I've actually become a bit of a fan of plasma under the right circumstances. So the plasma will build up in a machine, and once it builds up in them, it'll put them into the plasma blast state, and you have to deal damage to the machine during that time to get either a level 1 or a level 2 explosion. And if you've used plasma at all, then you know that level 1 and level 2 explosion are pretty underwhelming to say the least. But here's the thing that a lot of people don't know about plasma. If you're using the right type of weapon, like the All Mother's Blessing Tripcaster or the Last Argument Spike Thrower with the plasma spikes, the plasma can actually deal damage over time. It creates this, what I call a plasma puddle, which will continue to deal plasma damage to the machine if they're still in range. And this can be a really powerful way to deal damage. Now again, I've studied plasma a lot, and at the end of my plasma video, I became convinced that the sole reason why plasma even exists in the game at all is to combat the Slitherfang. Plasma is basically Slitherfang kryptonite. The Slitherfang is the only machine in the Forbidden West that's very weak to plasma, so you're gonna get an even bigger level 2 explosion. Not to mention that damage over time with those plasma puddles. The Slitherfang has such a large, wide body that's kind of always on the ground, so it's always kind of getting that damage over time from those different plasma puddles, and plasma will just absolutely shred Slitherfangs. If you're having trouble with Slitherfangs in the game, use plasma. I'm telling you, it'll work. It's a great element to combat Slitherfangs. So plasma is another one. While not the most practical and one that I probably wouldn't use all that much in just the open world, but it can be a lot of fun to play with. So I'm gonna go ahead and give plasma a B. Okay, PD, we've got 2 more. Who's next? Shock. Okay, shock. Shock is probably my favorite element to use, and there's a couple of reasons in particular why I like it. For one, most machines in the game are weak or at least not resistant to shock, so it's got a lot of different applications for a lot of the different machines you come up against in the Forbidden West. 2, it will just completely immobilize machines for a good amount of time. You get about 10 to 15 seconds of them being immobilized on the ground, which will pair really nicely with skills that you can get in the Burning Shores, like the Grapple Strike skill, where you can go in and deal a lot of damage. There's also just some really great shock weapons in the game. You get the Ancestors Return Shredder Gauntlet, which is probably my favorite weapon in the entire game. Not only does it deal damage from the shredders, but it also builds up shock really quickly. So it gives you this great 1-2 combination with dealing damage and being able to immobilize machines at the same time. And the shock animation itself is just so cool and detailed. You can really almost feel it as the electricity hits the machine and it just kind of like seizes up. Shock for me is probably the most fun element to use. Definitely incorporate using shock into your playstyle, as often as you can. It's super useful. So easy S tier for me. Okay, so last one, and that leaves us with acid. Acid will build up in machines and put them in the corrosive state, which deals damage over time specifically to armor plates on machines. And not only that, but you do get a damage buff while the machine is in the corrosive state to those armor plates. Maybe not quite as much as you'd get from something like Frost, but it's still a significant damage buff, which makes it really fun to use. And one of the things about acid that probably isn't talked about as much is that you won't damage the components of the machine by the acid itself. So it's a good way to deal damage to machines like Fire Claws, where you need to preserve that sack webbing. Even if the machine is covered in acid, the acid won't eat away at that webbing. Again, I think using it with the Shredder Gauntlet is probably just one of the more fun applications to use. What I really like about acid too is that it's a really powerful element to use in the late game. No spoilers, but you do come up against certain types of machines that are typically weak to acid. Even sort of like the final boss of the game is pretty weak to acid. So there's a lot of good application to it when you're in the later stages of the game, especially with some of those big bosses that you'll find. So acid for me is really great. Not quite S tier, not quite something as good as shock or something as useful as frost, but definitely a solid A tier. But what elements are your favorite and why? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for even more Horizon Forbidden West content. Thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you on the next one.